morning. Todd? Hello, good morning. I'm here to see if I'm just here to see if the microphone works. It does, yeah. You hear me? Good, well, welcome. Though 2 Schemmel courses have already are underway, University for a Day is the formal beginning of the fall semester. We welcome all of you. Schemmel loyalists back, and a special welcome to those who are newcomers to the forum. And I might add another very special welcome to someone that you have seen as coming in, our new a wonderful helper, Allison Morrison. There she is, and please give her a hearty welcome. And don't give her any problems. You never do. This is the day that we set aside for deep immersion in the state of our nation, domestically and in the place of in the world. Both have been subject to dramatic changes in the course of this year. Our aim, I may say our ambition, is to honor and capture the essence of our revered founding document, to ponder its relevance and its evolution through the years, and to assess its significance today. It is more important than ever that we have this discussion and pay due respect to the intentions of our founders who dared to put the future of this nation in the hands of the people. We, the people, with the guidance of that document, have created a nation that is answerable not to one person, but to the rule of law. And bear in mind that it is us, we the people, who make the laws, obey the laws, and when necessary, amend the laws. Today we have an administration that sometimes questions and even attempts to abandon that sacred civic process. Has our democracy become an endangered species? If so, it is only we who can save it from ourselves, as it were. The alternative to democracy is either anarchy or autocracy. We, instead of being citizens with all the rights and responsibilities that our American democracy affords us, would become subjects whose main responsibility would be to obey our leader. We don't intend to go that route, so let history and clear understanding of our role as citizens be our guide. And so we begin. Our first lecturer, Dr. Adam Pratt, Assistant Professor of History at the University. Adam received his doctorate in history at Louisiana State University with a focus on 19th century America. He will bring to light this morning the relevance and reputation of Andrew Jackson's presidency in his own time and his influence on our current president. Please welcome Adam to the podium.
So I want to thank Sandra for inviting me to do this. As I'm sure everybody knows, one does not say no to Sandra Meyer. You can, but you still get put on the docket. So. But thank you for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here. This is what I'm looking for. Okay. What? All right, so the question I had during the campaign and then after the election was, why was Trump's campaign going out of the way to compare him to Andrew Jackson, and what that might portend for his administration after he won? So that was the basic question that I have been thinking about a lot lately. And so these are my thoughts. I don't even know if I agree with what I've got here, so we'll hash that out. So on March 15th, 2017, Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, visited the Hermitage, the plantation home of the 7th president, Andrew Jackson, on what would have been that man's 250th birthday. In his remarks, Trump drew deliberate comparisons between himself and his predecessor. It was during the revolution that Jackson first confronted and defied an arrogant elite, he remarked. He sighed and asked, "Does that sound familiar to you? No wonder they keep talking about Trump and Jackson, Jackson and Trump. I know the feeling, Andrew." But the comparison went further. After recounting Jackson's biography, he concluded, as president, Jackson reclaimed the people's government from an emerging aristocracy. His victory shook the establishment like an earthquake. So in the first 8 months of his administration, Trump and his advisors and supporters have gone out of their way to identify Trump with the Tennessean and his populist image. The visit to the Hermitage was not his first effort to do this. Soon after the inauguration, Trump wasted little time making the connection explicit. On Tuesday, January 24th, he unveiled the latest portrait hanging in the Oval Office. Painted sometime in the early 1830s by Jackson's friend Ralph E.W. Earl, who lived at the White House for several years and churned out portraits as campaign propaganda that were meant to evoke images of the Founding Fathers. The portrait and its placement ensure that Andrew Jackson will loom over Trump's left shoulder as he makes decisions from his desk in the Oval Office. The visual similarities between the two men, in terms of personal style, are also rather striking. In the portrait, Jackson's red cloak is the most dramatic item of his attire, a deep red that offsets his stark white hair, which is the real star of the portrait here, and the most obvious point of comparison between the two men. You can see from the portrait that Jackson had a well-coiffed head of hair that many visitors to his White House said resembled a lion's mane, and perhaps this is why one of Jackson's biographers called him the American lion. Trump obviously also cares about his image, and in particular, the fact that his hair is real. Remember that it was Jimmy Fallon who famously yanked on it to prove to his viewers and voters that it was authentic, something that Jackson would have horsewhipped you for doing. But Trump is not unique in his efforts to tie his administration to that of Jackson. Several of his advisors, most notably Newt Gingrich and Rudy Giuliani, have also been explicit in their comparisons. On election night, Giuliani crowed, "This is like Andrew Jackson's victory. This is the people beating the establishment." 2 months after the inauguration, Gingrich wrote for Fox News that, quote, "Like Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump is an intensely American president." Although readers are left to wonder how they too can be more intensely American, the collective message was clear. Trump and other real Americans had reclaimed power from an effete global elite that represented a real threat to real American values. Nowhere was this posturing more forthcoming than from the president's advisor, Stephen Bannon. During the campaign, Bannon told The Hollywood Reporter that his goal for a Trump presidency was to remake politics as we know it. "I'm not a white nationalist," he began. "I'm a nationalist. I'm an economic nationalist. The issue now is about Americans looking to not get fucked over." What he wants is the downfall of the American global order as we know it. And while I don't think it's wrong to critique or think about America's economic and political structures as it relates to the rest of the world, what Bannon argued poses a threat to American interests and values. "Like Andrew Jackson's populism," he proclaimed, "we're going to build an entirely new political movement." And in the immediate wake of the president's inaugural address, Bannon again made the connection explicit. "I don't think we've had a speech like that since Andrew Jackson came to the White House. You could see it was very Jacksonian. It's got deep, deep roots of patriotism there." So from Bannon's framework, it seems that this patriotic disruption was the calling card of Jackson's politics and his blueprint for how to advise Trump. He wanted a near constant barrage of news about Trump cracking the establishment's facade. Quote, "There will be stuff every day," Bannon promised. So what are we to make of all of these comparisons? What does it mean for a president in the 21st century to make explicit comparisons to a man who governed in the 19th century, before the Civil War, before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments fundamentally altered the federal government's relationship with its citizens and the Constitution? In my time today, I want to use broad strokes to lay out some of the contours of Jackson's presidency and what that could portend for the rest of a Trump presidency. Perhaps most importantly, though, I think we need to take the words of Trump's advisors seriously. What exactly do they mean when they say they want to remake the American political system? And why would they draw on Jackson as a model for this sort of political upheaval? But because Trump hasn't yet occupied the Oval Office for a year, there are only a few direct comparisons that we can make in terms of policy accomplishments or even the tone of the administration. So what I want to do is compare their first year or so in office. And we have a couple of instances with speeches, for example, that will allow us to directly compare their public addresses. And what I first want to do is return to Trump's inaugural address to tease out themes that might make it Jacksonian, and then compare it to what Jackson had to say. Next, we'll look at each administration's policy goals and how they went about achieving them. And from there, we'll try to draw more lasting conclusions about what it means for Trump to call himself Jacksonian. Okay. So early in Trump's inaugural address, the 45th president returned to one of the key themes of his campaign. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government, while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. So obviously this played into what Trump supporters and advisors had been saying for months. But for Trump to lead with this sentiment was unique. Most inaugural addresses, even those in the midst of civil or world wars or panics or depressions, took a more hopeful and positive tone. So I think he's signaling here at the beginning of his term that he was striving for unconventionality. He's also hearkening back to his catchy campaign slogan that festooned so many a red hat, "Make America Great Again." So while he is on message for his campaign, he should have been using this moment to transition, to signal to Americans that he's not in campaign mode, but he's going to govern. That didn't happen. The rest of the speech bears this out. Americans want good schools for their children, safe neighborhoods for their families, and good jobs for themselves, he continued. And just to make sure that his audience agreed, he stated, "These are just and reasonable demands of a righteous people and a righteous public." So he then lays out what he calls this American carnage, which he describes as families trapped in inner city cycles of poverty, crumbling drug-infested neighborhoods, and shuttered factories. To make sure that no one could forget one of his campaign promises, Trump pledged, from this day forward, it's going to be only America first, and that America will start winning again. From there, he asked America to set aside their differences and to replace them with patriotism. So there's a lot going on in this speech. And much of it, I think, has to be contextualized in the intellectual and cultural movements that brought Trump to power. Obviously, deindustrialization, the rise of free trade, and American youth leaving the towns that they grew up in and moving to cities all have significant effects on the American psyche. Moreover, after 8 years of a black president, Trump's campaign made light of growing racial unrest, and he benefited electorally from the disfranchisement of black voters in several swing states. In addition, the ferment of the internet and a variety of overtly racist online communities that defend themselves by couching what they're doing in terms of free speech, coupled with many Americans' fundamental distrust of the Clintons, to cause his popularity to swell, and surprisingly, he won the Electoral College. But for all of Trump's talk about building border walls, ending free trade, and making America great again, the core group of Trump supporters argues for an economic nationalism that champions American manufacturing and seeks to punish corporations who offshore their production or excess revenue. Part of this economic stance is also rooted in this distrust of globalization and free trade and the elite who benefit from this. In the mindset, from this mindset, it's the real Americans who have been left behind, be they mom and pop stores on Main Street in the Midwest or coal miners here in Pennsylvania. This talk of real Americans, remember, is rooted in a sense of righteous anger that the previous president, a black man, did more to benefit racial minorities at the expense of whites. So this economic nationalism is also rooted in the perennial problem at the history of our country, and that's race. So his speech hit all of the high points required to satisfy even his most diehard supporters. An acknowledgement that America's inner cities, populated primarily by people of color, are failures, or worse, a drain on American economic efficiency. That public schools have failed our students, that globalization has enervated the American worker, and that government regulation has strangled America's economic potential. Although he painted a stark portrait of the United States in 2017, he offered few solutions in terms of policy. He noted that we were currently overseeing the very sad depletion of our military. He mentioned that he would bring back American jobs, borders, wealth, and dreams. That he would build more highways and bridges, and in doing those things, he would follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. So viewers and listeners would have found it impossible to miss his confidence and swagger. By contrast, Andrew Jackson's first inaugural address is restrained, even humble at times. He ended his remarks by admitting to feeling overwhelmed by his new responsibilities. A diffidence, he said, perhaps too just in my own qualifications, will teach me to look with reverence on the examples of public virtue left by my illustrious predecessors. The same diffidence induces me to hope for instruction and aid from the coordinate branches of government and support of my fellow citizens generally. So before this unexpected display of humility, Jackson laid out what he saw as his constitutional obligations. His job description, basically. As the instrument of the federal Constitution, he began, it will devolve on me to execute the laws of the United States, to superintend the foreign relations, to manage their revenue, to command their forces, and by communication to the legislature, to watch over and promote their interests generally. Of course, he's using the plural form of the United States, hence their. Jackson positioned himself squarely at the heart of a constitutional republic, as someone who would fulfill his constitutional obligations, but little more. His two major policy statements were reserved for government revenues and national defense. First, he promised to extinguish the national debt. And next, he refused to create a standing army, instead believing that armies were dangerous to free governments in peacetime. He acknowledged the importance of internal improvements and the spread of knowledge, and stated that it was his sincere and constant desire to create a just and liberal policy towards Indians that would ensure their humane and considerate attention to their rights. Jackson also came to office at a time of great social and political unrest. He continually claimed to represent the interests of the sovereign people, who by 1828 had largely been granted the right to vote based on their sex and skin color, rather than the amount of property they owned. By unleashing the democratic impulses of the white male electorate, politicians had turned what had once been the purview of elites into a widespread, popular, and participatory event. Jackson, who had grown up poor, always claimed to represent the will of the people. He reserved his disdain for his political enemies, whom he never forgot nor forgave, and for economic systems, including banks, especially banks, that benefited the few over the many. For example, internal improvements championed by his political rival, the Bank of the United States, which he likened to a monster that needed killing. And rest assured, when Andrew Jackson threatened to kill you, he would do it. So at this point, having looked at their inaugural addresses, what can we say about their agendas when they both came to office? So Jackson's goals included reducing the national debt, limiting the growth of the army, continuing internal improvements, and creating a lasting Indian policy. Suffice to say, by the time he left office 8 years later, he had accomplished all of these tasks. For example, when he entered office, the national debt sat at $58 million. And most of this was left over from the War of 1812. Jackson, though, didn't really have to do a whole lot here because it was Congress who mandated a debt reduction of $10 million per year. And he just happened to be the president when that mandate came about. But like all good politicians, he claimed credit for it. However, he did expedite the process when he killed the Bank of the United States and liquidated its assets and used that to also pay down the debt. By the time he left office, the debt sat at $32. But in the process, Jackson had effectively deregulated the economy. And when he left office, the nation was sinking into the Panic of 1837, which up to that point was the nation's worst economic crisis. For his first 2 years in office, Jackson kept his word when it came to growing the army. He shrunk the army by 8% in his first 2 years, so the number of troops went from about 12,100 down to 11,100. However, in order to implement his Indian policy, which we will talk about in a minute, he had to expand the army. And by 1837, it had almost doubled in size and expenditure. Most Americans in the 19th century saw the army as a threat to individual liberty and a telltale sign of a government that was seeking to compel its citizens to obedience. Jackson, of course, came from a military background and understood intimately the terrible powers that military commanders wielded. During the election of 1828, He was accused of ordering the execution of 6 militiamen who dissented over the fact that even though the British had been defeated after the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson kept the militia in the field, and for their dissent, he had them summarily executed. In 1818, Jackson, without orders, crossed national boundaries and invaded Spanish Florida, where he arrested 2 foreign agents and had them executed. In some way, then, Jackson, I think, understood the tension at the heart of a democracy, which didn't mesh with a standing army. And so he promised, for a while at least, not to expand the power of the government at the expense of people's rights. Obviously, Trump has inherited a very different United States, a very different geopolitical situation than Jackson. But in this instant, Trump is decidedly un-Jacksonian. You can see a variety of examples, including filling up his cabinet with members of the military, or his first budget proposal asked for an increase of $54 billion in military spending. Jackson also had a very complicated relationship with internal improvements, or what we would now call infrastructure projects. His predecessor, John Quincy Adams, defeated him in the election of 1824, largely on his promise to create what he called the American system, which was a large federal works project to fund and build roads and canals and bridges, dredge rivers and ports. Quincy Adams also encouraged the creation of an American university funded by taxpayers, as well as a system of observatories that he dreamily called lighthouses in the sky. He did not have the gift of the turn of a phrase. Jackson's campaign rhetoric lashed out at these government expenses, and most famously, in his first year in office, he vetoed a project called the Maysville Road that ran through the congressional district of his chief rival, Henry Clay. Over the course of his presidency, Jackson vetoed 6 additional internal improvement bills and vetoed more legislation than his previous 6 predecessors combined. Make of that what you will. Although he talked a big game about his disdain for internal improvements and government expenditures, Jackson spent about 60% more per year on internal improvements than did John Quincy Adams. So his record on this is ambiguous, and the vetoes, we think, were used strategically to send messages to rivals. Trump, of course, has made his career as a real estate developer, so it should come naturally for the man to gravitate towards building projects, things that he can put his name on. These are tangible, visible things that people will use regularly. However, his proposed funding mechanism so far would involve leveraging private money in the form of tax breaks and private control over public infrastructure projects. These are, on the surface then, it appears that both men have a complicated response to infrastructure. But at the end of the day, Jackson largely funded those projects. And this is where we best witnessed his approach to the Constitution. He continually positioned himself as enacting the will of the people and used the veto as an important weapon to root out unnecessary spending and to attack his political enemies. Trump, of course, hasn't issued a veto yet. But to really exercise his inner Jacksonian, it may become necessary for him to assert his power in a similar way. That, of course, would rely upon Congress to actually pass legislation. So, Last in Jackson's list of goals was his desire to create a just and lasting policy towards Native Americans. The entirety of Jackson's first year in office was spent accomplishing this task, and he expended almost all of his political capital to do it. He spent a great deal of time visiting with members of the House of Representatives and making the sausage, as it were. The result, of course, was the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which promised to move Native Americans from lands east of the Mississippi to lands in what is now present-day Oklahoma. The legislation created a moral crisis in many religious communities, especially in the northern states, who saw the move as unusually cruel and against America's values. Jackson objected. What was cruel, he argued, would be to allow American frontiersmen to continue their attacks and encroachments against Native communities that would eventually lead to their slaughter and destruction. He maintained to his dying day that Indian removal and tragedies like the Trail of Tears were necessary and would account for the survival of Native peoples today. The policy was so popular in states that stood to gain valuable cotton-growing land, especially my home state of Georgia, that the resulting land rush was called the white man's chance, which recognized, of course, the racial connotations of Jackson's policy and his efforts to cater to his voters. Trump, I think we could argue, is also trying to recreate this white man's chance with all of its gendered and racial components. His statements made about women during the campaign, his desire for a travel ban, his willingness to see DACA expire, his ham-fisted outreach to the black communities, and his unwillingness to denounce neo-Nazis after Charlottesville are all important reminders about who he deems worthy of government aid and protection. But the effort to implement Indian removal caused a serious break in the political system of the time. In 1830, when the bill was being debated and eventually passed, only one political party existed. They were called the Democratic Republicans. Unable to find party unity, it's upside down. Unable to find party unity on the bill, the party splintered into regional and religious voting blocs that came to define Jacksonian politics. And historians can predict with a high degree of accuracy where politicians in 1830 would fall in the two-party system that was in its infancy. So those who supported the bill tended to vote Democrat and supported Jackson. Those who voted against it would later join the Whig Party and would oppose Jackson. In other words, Jackson's political triumphs remade the political system of the time. He forged a new coalition that included Southern planters, Northern immigrants, and Midwestern farmers. The Whigs were this sort of motley coalition of religious reformers, business interests, the growing middle class, anti-slavery advocates, anti-immigrant advocates. It was odd. And although this second party system ultimately failed to stave off the Civil War, the contest between the Democrats and the Whigs was something new. The architect of this new system was Martin Van Buren, the Sly Fox of Kinderhook, which is the greatest political nickname of all time. Van Buren felt that national political parties, partisan competition, would actually engender nationalism. So that a politics based on sectionalism that was fueled by the question of slavery in the territories would not tear the nation apart. So in this framing, it was Jackson that was the lightning rod, rather than the question of slavery. Issues about the tariff or nullification or internal improvements were framed as a question of, do you like Jackson or do you not? Rather than how those problems could pose a danger to the slavery question. So hopefully you can kind of see where I'm going here. Although we don't have an issue that is as emotional as slavery, we do have a president that has become a lightning rod. And although his persona, his background, and some of his policies make him decidedly un-Jacksonian, his election redrew the political map in a decidedly Jacksonian way. And this, I think, is what his advisors, and Bannon in particular, mean when they say that he's Jacksonian, that he's going to recreate our political norms. Because he convinced so many white working class voters to change party affiliations, because he energized swaths of the electorate, including white supremacists, who usually don't vote, and because he was able to get a majority of white women to vote for him, he redrew the political map. The question now is whether this current realignment is permanent, or if 2016 was something different. And I don't have the answer to that. Though I think we'll get a preliminary look about how the voters feel about this in 2018. Meanwhile, Trump's realization in the past few weeks, when he was heard saying to an aide, quote, "People really fucking hate me," has caused him to pivot on a few things. From the budget to taxes, and all in an effort to curtail public disapproval. It remains to be seen if this new Trump, which is what the media has called him, will remain, or if this too is a calculated move designed to curry favor with new constituencies, to rewrite the old political alliances, and to keep the political establishment off balance. Whatever the case, I think we should be hesitant to compare Trump and Jackson. Trump has not shown the sort of political stamina needed to pass a major piece of legislation in his first year, even though some of their policies were similar. Jackson understood, moreover, the use of bluster and bravado, whereas that seems to be Trump's MO. Finally, we simply don't know if Trump's campaign has written the political rule book, or if his presidency is more about the unique climate of 2016. Moreover, I'm not entirely sure why the campaign chose Jackson in the first place. Obviously, the tough guy image that Trump wants to project and is part of his brand seems to mesh with that of Jackson's persona and honor. But Jackson's reputation was backed up by actions. He fought in duels and killed people. He reportedly stabbed a business partner, which is what that picture is right there. He stabbed a business partner who double-crossed him. More importantly, he got things done. And he ignored the controversy around him. But of course, all of those things, they might be viewed as positives, were also undermined by the fact that he was a slaveholder and that he perpetrated ethnic cleansing. So again, why would the Trump campaign try to latch onto Jackson as a model? Why not Lincoln, who tried to spread the Republican Party into the South during and after the Civil War? Or Teddy Roosevelt, who also masqueraded as a tough guy? I have a feeling, though, that Bannon was behind most of this, especially in the wake of the Treasury Department a few years ago, saying that it was going to replace Jackson on the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman. I think this is the culture wars, right? This was a signal to various parts of the electorate that a Trump administration wouldn't be held hostage to quote unquote political correctness. Ironically, though, removing Jackson from the 20 would actually make him really happy because he hated paper money. He hated banks, and his appearance on U.S. legal tender is probably an insult to him. But I think this just goes to show the high levels of historical illiteracy and the dangers of using the past to score political points in the present. I'm going to stop there, so thanks.
So now it's our turn. Questions, comments?
Yes. From things that I've read, I'm under the impression that probably Stephen Bannon wrote most of Donald Trump's inaugural address. Are you under that impression?
I think I read that as well, that Bannon, if he didn't write it, he had a heavy hand in editing parts of it, yes. So I think that's accurate.
Watching the news the past 2 nights, we've learned of the dressing down, the further facts in the case, the dressing down of Jeff Sessions back in May. Today we call such a thing a smackdown, and it was enough to make Jeff Sessions write a letter of resignation. Well, the other people in the West Wing were greatly alarmed, and Vice President Pence went after Jeff Sessions and got him to withdraw the resignation. Further, we learn of a smackdown of John Kelly, and that's pretty disturbing because he has been, more than anyone else, someone who would bring order out of chaos. And it seems very dangerous if John Kelly doesn't have super military discipline, because he could put his fist through Trump's face. and that would be awful in the national sense, but it might be exactly what Trump needs. Now we can't go forward from such an instance, but John C. Calhoun served as Andrew Jackson's vice president. When to win?
28 to 32, so during his first term.
There was a smackdown there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, so John C. Calhoun was, he ran initially as Jackson's vice president during the campaign of 1828. He was from South Carolina. He made his career as a nationalist. And when he went home to his constituents late in the 1820s, he started hearing all this talk about states' rights and nullification, and he got on board because he's a politician who wants to preserve his seat in power. He authored a document called the Exposition and Protest, which outlined a way for states to nullify federal laws. It was anonymously authored, and South Carolinians followed it. They created a body to nullify the tariff of 1828, which they saw as unjust and discriminatory to their economic interests. When Jackson found out that Calhoun was behind all of this mischief, he obviously got angry. The governor of South Carolina went along with the whole nullification thing. Jackson had Congress pass what was a piece of legislation called the Force Bill, which allowed him to raise an army to march on South Carolina and make them obey federal laws. The governor of South Carolina raised the state's militia, and it was a contest of chicken, basically. Behind the scenes, though, and this is important, Jackson worked with Congress to lower the tariff over the next decade. He did not invade South Carolina. The governor of South Carolina got the message and sent the militia home, although the nullification committee, as sort of a last, I mean, this is just great. It's so typically South Carolina. They nullified the force bill, saying it's actually illegal for you to invade us, which is just hilarious. So needless to say, Calhoun was not on the ticket in 1832. There is this story about the Jefferson dinner that all transpired during the nullification crisis. Calhoun gave a toast, something along the lines of, our rights are most dear, something like that. And then Jackson responded with a toast that said, the federal union, it must be preserved. So it was, this sort of tit for tat that they were doing. They did not like one another. They did not have a healthy working relationship. But the fact that the Vice President of the United States was actively trying to find a way to undermine federal authority, and therefore Jackson's authority, angered Jackson to no end. Jackson did not see the world in shades of gray. He saw it like the old westerns, where the good guys wore the white hats and the bad guys wore the black hats, and that was how he viewed the world. You were either a white hat or a black hat. And Calhoun, dating back to Jackson's invasion of Spanish Florida, was not seen as sort of his ally.
Did Jackson threaten violence to Calhoun?
No, he threatened the governor of South Carolina. He said that he would hang the governor of South Carolina. It's possible that he threatened Calhoun, but I don't know. I don't know. That letter's been burned. Yeah.
Back when I was in high school, Jackson was generally ranked as one of the near great presidents, not one of the greats, but the near greats. Where do you think he stands today, and also particularly in light of, you touched on the Panic of '37 and his monetary policies, the destruction of the bank, the balancing of the budget, etc.
So I think we have to talk about what we mean by great, right? Did he accomplish everything he set out to do? For the most part, yes. Obviously, as a 21st century human being looking back on those policies, we can find them racist and abhorrent and all of those things. But for people at the time, he was, if you supported him, you had an almost religious devotion to the man. And if you didn't support him, you thought that the apocalypse was nigh. And so I think that actually gives us a lot of insight into living in the age of Jackson, or the age of Trump, rather. Can we call it that? I don't know. So in terms of greatness, he was pretty skilled as a political leader. He had a lot of experience. So I think he knew how to accomplish his goals, and he didn't listen to his critics. I think that's a useful skill for political leaders to have. But in terms of great, meaning we talk about him a lot. Yeah, Jackson's a great man, because we're still talking about him and still debating the meaning of his legacy. Yeah.
The economic.
Oh, the economic bit. So Jackson distrusted paper money and banks, mostly because he had been He felt that his business had been affected negatively in 1819 when there was another panic. So he distrusted paper money. He didn't think it was worth anything. So he passed a piece of legislation called the Specie Circular that said that when you buy land from the government or pay your taxes, it has to be in gold or silver, which caused a massive deflation and all sorts of economic problems. People in the 1830s, though, and for most of the 19th century, didn't necessarily blame the government or presidents for economic problems. That's a decidedly, I think, 21st century or 20th century phenomenon. So Jackson didn't get a lot of blame for that at the time. But I think now we have a little bit more sophisticated understanding of economic systems that I think it's fair to critique him for causing the Panic of 1837. So in that light, I think economically, he set the United States back quite a bit. So I think his economic policy was more damaging than helpful. Does that answer your question?
Pretty much.
Okay. Janice? Just yell.
Okay, I can speak louder.
Oh, okay. The recording. It's all.
So Jackson, despite his flaws, was able to be reelected. And he was polarizing, but somehow was able to rally his troops and to stay in office. It's a terrifying thought. Can you reflect on Jackson and how that happened?
Yeah, so he's able to do this because once states started liberalizing their voting laws and more white men were able to vote, state governments and the federal governments were doing things that favored white men. And so if you're a farmer, one of the things that Jackson was doing is he was opening up huge amounts of land in the West to sale, which was something that John Quincy Adams hadn't done. So this was seen as a direct way of aiding potential constituents. This is government aid, right? So because there's no real hard or defined political system, he's able to sort of pick and choose which constituents he wants to help. And his spending for internal improvements did a lot for that as well. He also had a very robust and pretty savvy media campaign, including newspaper editors who were in his pocket and would report only favorable things about Jackson. So there are, worrying contrasts or similarities. He was able to remake the political system in a way that I don't know if Trump can do. And also the sort of media pervasiveness, our amount of literacy is really high. So it's not an exact one-to-one comparison, but yeah, there are sort of troubling similarities.
Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be that the states' rights issue during that era was much more of an economic issue than it was a slavery issue, and that Jackson, being a nationalist in that sense, and a total contradiction to Calhoun, was able to establish a national constituency that would give him strong political support?
Yes and no. So it was an economic issue. For South Carolinians and many Southerners, it was not. So the fear was that if the federal government can set a precedent and take private land to build a road or a canal or something like that, then they could also confiscate other forms of property, including slaves. So Southerners felt that they had to have a mechanism in order to prevent this. And that's what nullification was about. It was about a way to preserve their economic interests and private property, which meant slaves.
Question or comment. It seems that one stunning difference between the two presidents is that Jackson had a great respect for the office and, spoke about that and kind of knew a lot more about the office, being a person in politics. And I think that that's an unfortunate departure from that attitude in President Trump.
I completely agree, Sandra, that the knowledge that Jackson had, he was a lawyer and a district attorney and a judge before he became a militia general. So he had a deep knowledge of the law. One historian has said that his decisions as a judge were not learned, but they were normally correct. They were often replete with misspellings, and Jackson was famous for saying, "Never trust a man who's not creative enough to spell a word only one way," which is just fantastic. But yeah, I mean, that's one of sort of the shortcomings of Trump, is that he hasn't had time in public office. He doesn't quite understand the nature of a deliberative democracy. He's used to getting things done quickly and not having to negotiate with other, interests other than his own. Yeah.
I finally had a chance to watch the Bannon interview, and I may be in error about the period that he was praising, but I think it was this period, and he went on and on about how it was the period of citizenship. And I know you didn't talk about immigration, but was there a dip in immigration, or was there an emphasis in citizenship that would have created a beacon that Bannon would have wanted to return to those years?
So citizenship. So there were various laws for immigrants. You had to have a residency period, and during the early republic, those were frequently changed. The duration that you had to be here before you could become a citizen changed. I don't know what the time frame was during Jackson's presidency. But no, if anything, immigration in the 1830s was skyrocketing, from Ireland and Germany in particular. And so you start seeing in the 1830s these Catholic communities that were coming over. And this was another way that Jackson increased the number of voters. He really sort of spoke to the common man or the working man, including these immigrant communities. So they were another vital component of his coalition. So if anything, Jackson would have encouraged mass immigration because they tended to vote Democrat. This gentleman over here has had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah, so I was taught that Jackson was the founder of the spoils system, which is handing out government jobs to your political friends. Did that have that had quite a lasting effect, I think. Is that one of the reasons, perhaps, why he was reelected many times?
So the spoils system has long been a tradition in the United States. In fact, from Washington up really through Grant, American presidents doled out patronage jobs. Jackson was a little bit different in that he removed perfectly competent government agents and replaced them with his cronies. which was something new. So the most sought after job was Postmaster General, because the Postmaster General dispensed all of those local postal worker positions. So that was, you really had to pull some strings to become postmaster. And it was expected that the postmaster would sort of have his minions campaigning for the president in a way that we don't expect government officials to do now. I don't know if there's ever been a study on the electoral impact of that. People's opinions about the spoils system waxed and waned, but it was basically that was sort of the norm up until President Grant, when things just got out of control, and they implemented civil service reforms. So it was a lasting feature of how you practice politics at the federal level. So that was a very negative thing. Yeah.
Did John C. Calhoun or Henry Clay have presidential aspirations, or were there any other politicians that kind of felt slighted by the election of Jackson?
Everyone, yeah. Calhoun, but most importantly Clay. He ran for president 3 times. He never won. Finally, after the 3rd time, he said, well, I would rather be right than be president. So he desperately wanted to be president. And this was the charge against him in 1824 when he was a presidential candidate. He obviously didn't win, but he was the Speaker of the House at the time. And he went to John C. Calhoun, supposedly in this corrupt bargain, and said, if you make me Secretary of State, I'll have my supporters in Congress vote for you, so you'll become president. Or John Quincy Adams, yeah. And so that's how, supposedly, John Quincy Adams won the election of 1824. So this was the moment when Jackson began to hate Henry Clay. And the two men never really saw eye to eye.
Adam, do you see any similarities between now and back in the 1830s, where you mentioned Jeff Sessions, the dressing down he got from President Trump? Do you see any similarities between a potential fracturing of the existing political parties and a realignment occurring? I recall growing up, I think we're all, and older folks here for the most part, when we had Senator Eastland from Mississippi, Senator John Stennis. You stated that you're from Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
They were Democrats.
Yep,
Now the
solid
entire
South.
Deep South is Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a potential opening here for the Democratic Party to get back in play in the South?
Many of my friends from graduate school would certainly think that this is going to happen. But if you look at some of the demographics in the South, especially the Latino community that has been moving there since the 90s, I think there is a potential for some southern states, or at least, to flip back to the Democrats. I don't know how that would play out, in the Rust Belt or things like that. I still haven't quite got that figured. If, former industrial workers switching to the Republican Party is a current thing, and union membership's going to continue to decline. I don't know. But I think there are places where this realignment is happening, and I think maybe this is me being hopeful, but I think the South is one of those places.
Any more questions? If not, thank you.